Welcome to Constructive Conversations, Finding Valid Information and How to Use It. This will be a three-part series. We're starting this evening. If you miss one, that's all right, or you can't join us until a little bit later for some of the others. We're going to have these recorded. So just a friendly reminder, these will be recorded and they'll be housed on the Hudson DEI Alliance website. So you'll be able to access those. I did send out some handouts earlier this afternoon. If you registered a little bit later or didn't get those, I'll send them. I'll be sure to send them out to everyone who signed up a little bit later than this evening when we're off as well. All right. So my name is Jen Batten, and I am with the League of Women Voters of Hudson. And we're really excited that my colleague and friend, Dr. Julie Shedd from the School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University, is able to join us this evening. Hopefully you had a chance to take a look at her bio there, and she's one of the specialists with media and peace building among her many other focuses of research. So we're really excited to have her. So this evening, I'm going to hand it over to Julie to share with you a little bit more about herself and share about the series. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jen. I'm happy to be here. Maybe just to give you a quick 30-second thumbnail about where this kind of series began. In 2016, the associate director of our local libraries here in Northern Virginia came to our school and said, hey, I'm really concerned about the as a library, what we can do to help handle some of the media literacy questions that were happening. So this is the run up to the 2016 election, lots of concerns about what's real and what's not, and getting good information. And we were also obviously seeing that people were having a more and more difficult time having conversations about things that matter. And so the associate director of the library and I put our heads together and started developing here in Northern Virginia a program in our local library system, the Fairfax County Library System, which was the start of what Jen and I will be going through tonight. And we've done a couple different iterations of that. And more recently, the program we're most directly doing is one that we did this last spring in a virtual environment here for a group. So I'm really excited about it because I think for me, the ability to do everyday conflict communication better, to really think about media literacy, and to get ourselves more comfortable in this communication world is a really important set of skills that many of us didn't get taught at any time along the way, or we've had to pick up as we go. So when we're thinking about media literacy skills, what's really key about this is not to say that we're going to go to find one truth. What we're looking for are skills that we can use to help us evaluate information that's coming at us, to give us a sense of what information is most likely to be reliable. What should we be more likely to pay attention to, and how do we tell that? What are some of the tools we can use to do that? So we're going to do a couple different things along that line over the next few weeks during these sessions. Jen, you want to talk a little about the civil discourse and basic dialogue skills and what we're doing with that?
Is it working? Can you hear it?
Yeah. No, I can't. I did before.
Okay.
So
no, I do.
Maybe Julie, if you could.
Yep. Okay.
That'd be great. Cool. So for those who just joined us a little bit later, this will be recorded and placed onto the Hudson DEI Alliance webpage. So if you miss anything, and those who joined us a little bit later, registered a little bit later, we'll send you out the handouts as soon as this ends. And those will be the handouts for all three sessions you'll have. So in addition to the media literacy, which Julie will be sharing with you, I'm going to be sharing with you, as well as Julie, some skills as we go through on civil discourse and basic dialogue skills for better understanding. And so we're going to take a look briefly at the difference between dialogue and debate. And these are certainly skills that, regardless of your political leanings, are going to be very helpful as we move forward here. So with the media literacy, do you want to share a couple of the topics there, Julie?
Sure. So the first thing we're going to start with today is actually looking at finding and evaluating news sources. So, when I was growing up, it was a lot easier to figure out what were sources that I could count on, because those were typically things that would come in that I could hold in my hand, right? They were a newspaper, or they were a magazine, something that I knew where they were published from. That landscape is entirely different now, and it is really hard to decipher when information is good, even when we think we might know the name of the source. So we're going to talk a little bit about some tools you can use to evaluate the likelihood that something's reliable, or get a sense of whether it might be good information. We're also going to spend a little bit of time talking about bias and how different kinds of how our brains work that help us process information and lead us to trust certain kinds of sources and not others, as well as some tools to fact check. So you've probably seen that there's been a big increase in kind of professional fact checking, right? In fact, what fact checking is, interestingly, is about, most of us read things kind of top to bottom. Good fact checkers read things and they look at another source, they look at another source. It's called lateral reading. We don't have time to do all of that all the time, but we can do some basic fact checking. So we're going to talk some about that also.
Great, thanks. And then some of the different skills that, when you put them all together, are for effective dialogue. So we'll be today thinking about some effective listening skills and supportive listening. We'll also be looking at how emotions influence conflict, positions versus interests, and thinking a little bit about that. And so we'll be giving you some different tools for your toolbox for engaging in different conversations that you'll have perhaps in the future in classrooms if you're educators, or with your family over the dinner table. So one of the things that we wanted to just take a look at briefly is the difference between dialogue and debate. And so you'll have in your handouts that you'll have a much more detailed explanation between the difference between dialogue, debate, and discussion, but really thinking about debate as proving the other person wrong, versus dialogue where you're looking at collaborative understanding of whatever the topic might be. And so these are some of the skills and strategies that you'll be able to use on a number of different topics. The goal of dialogue really being understanding versus winning at all costs with debate. And thinking about with dialogue, dialogue looks more and focuses more too on thinking about the identities of the person. So many times people will think about the big 8 of identity, so race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, some of the other aspects of identity, versus in debate, not thinking about the different aspects of identity and how that plays into whatever the topic is at hand. And with dialogue, really focusing on interests. So the interests are why we want something versus what it is that we want, and really works to get to some, if not all, of the interests of both parties when you're having conversations, to see some sort of connection, versus debate, which really focuses just on the what versus the whys, and not an interest in coming together. Anything else you'd like to add there, Julie, before we move on?
I would also just add that I think the premise for our conversation here tonight and through the series is that what we're looking at is skills for engaging in conversation about topics that may be hard, or about where we disagree, with people that we care about and want to continue to have a relationship with. So, we kind of jokingly, when we first started doing this in 2016, called this series Make Thanksgiving Great Again, right? How can we actually sit at a table with people that we care about, have a relationship with, and disagree about, and as opposed to just never talking about it, because I think that's become the default, right? What are some ways that we can actually engage with people that we want to maintain a relationship with? So these are energy intensive skills, right? These are not necessarily something that you're going to want to do with everybody that you come across on the street who you don't agree with. But really, if you want to have that relationship, want to be able to have a good conversation. I'm seeing a lot, at least in my own feed, about what to do right now. For instance, we had such a polarizing moment happen on last Wednesday. How do we have conversations with people right now about what happened? That's what we're up to here, is not necessarily like, here's the thing you're going to go do in public on stage, but how do we engage with people that we care about and in a relationship with?
Absolutely. Not that there isn't a place for debate in education circles or different kinds of contexts, but really if we're focused on better understanding and we want a relationship with the other person. That dialogue is really some of the skill sets that we'd like to see being used. So this first session, Julie's going to take us through, and you have some of this information in your handouts. Again, if you didn't receive those yet, I'll send you a copy right after the session. You'll be able to think about evaluating a source. So how do we do that? We'll look at identifying some collaborative communication skills and practicing if we have some time there at the end. If we don't have time for practice, the tips and tools will also be in your handouts there. All right. So one of the things for housekeeping here, so if you have not, probably everybody has used Zoom by this time during COVID here, but just in case. So if you scroll your cursor down at the bottom, you'll be able to see your toolbar will pop up. And so you're more than welcome to go to reactions and raise your hand. If you'd like to do that, you could also just put your question in the chat, and both myself and Julie will be monitoring that. And we will have a poll coming up, and Julie will share a little bit more about that as well. Julie? You're muted, Julie. Sorry.
Thank you. I was trying to use good mute discipline and of course forgot. All right, I want to do just a quick get a sense of reaction from you all about where you are, where you get your news, where do you get your information. So I'm going to put up a quick, why don't you hold on that slide, Jen, go back for a second. Put up a quick poll, just take a minute. I'm curious, where do you get your news from? And it should give you an option. You should have gotten a poll on your screen so you can just choose an answer. All right, so we've got almost everybody's done. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hit end polling so you can see the answer. So almost everybody came up as, or not almost everybody, our highest answer was news websites or apps, but then right behind that we had TV and radio, which were mixed. Let me share the results so you can see them. So many of you are using multiple sources for information, which is great. So you're getting a chance to see information from a variety of places. Jen, you want to go ahead and show the national results poll? So this is, we're just going to show you quickly a poll that was done nationally to look at the same question. So you can kind of see where your results fit in. So across the US, the majority of people were saying TV with news websites or apps right behind that. So you all are pretty close to that. You're all using radio more than kind of on the national average to get news. So that's interesting. All right, let me go ahead and flip to the next poll and get you to take a look at that one. Okay, sorry. All right, here we go. So this one's about social media, and this is going to help us, I think, a little bit to know, what you all are doing and what you're interested in. Can you answer a little bit about how often you're using social media? All right, we have some serious social media users. Okay, so 70% of you are using social media daily. 75% are using social media daily. So that's cool. We're going to talk a little bit more next week about social media algorithms and how to kind of work with, you probably heard the terms echo chambers and filter bubbles and some of that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that next week, particularly focused on social media. So that's awesome. That's great. That's really useful to have. So we have nobody who's in the never category, so that's useful. So Jen just put up that here's what the national averages are. So do you want to go ahead and hit the next screen on the slides, Jen? All right, so if we think about daily, 74%, so about the same as you all, are using Facebook daily, and then we see these numbers kind of decreasing for some of the other channels. So you all are pretty close to where the national average is. All right. We can go ahead and flip to the next slide, Jen. So just if you have a desire to know that those studies came, these are the resources for those studies, and we'll share a bibliography sheet that has them, but we can go ahead and flip to the next one. So one of the things that I think is important is to start with thinking about what's the problem we're trying to solve. So we hear a lot and we get frustrated about the kind of information we're getting. But not all information is created equal, right? There's some different issues that we might have with the information we're coming across. So you may have seen this a lot, but there are some, one of the types of misinformation or bad information that gets out there are things that were intended to be parody. So this would be online, there's a website called The Onion, right? And they're intentionally parody accounts. Babylon Bee on social media is a parody account. But also like Andy Bershowitz, who writes for, I think, The New Yorker, is also a parody person, right? And if you're not paying attention, you don't know that, you might come across those kinds of links and think they're real and accidentally stumble on a parody account. And it's not always entirely clear when you might know that. And so we'll talk a little about one way to do that. The second is, misleading content that you might come across. So whether it is that someone is only showing you part of it, right? They're only giving part of a story, or they are taking a particular set of information and putting a different explanation to it than might actually make sense to you. But so there might be actually valid pieces of information in that content, but they're just being framed in a way that doesn't make sense. We also see imposter content, and this is, you may see this with some prominent websites where instead of having a .com at the end, if you look really closely, it might say something else, right? A .net, or it might have an international prefix at the end. It's not unusual for people that are creating fake information to actually try to spoof some of our websites that we might have trust in. So that's another thing that we're going to keep an eye out for. And maybe I should say that there is, and the next one is fabricated content. There is an industry of people who are making money off of creating completely fake information, putting it online with snazzy headlines that get people to click on it, and then they make their money off the advertising dollars, right? So when you click on it and then there's an advertiser on the right, that's how they're making money. So I was trying to figure this out forever. I was like, why are people doing this? There's actually people who are making a living doing this. And this is this fabricated content piece as well as some of the others. I think those are usually a little bit easier to spot once you get into them because the markers aren't there than some of these other kinds, but that's a little bit different, right? I mean, there's a category of things that are just completely fake news, right? They're completely created, manufactured to get you to click, which is different than some of the other categories that we might be concerned about. So we talked about manipulated content, or there's false content. There's a lot of ways in which people can manipulate some of our information, and we'll talk some about that when we're doing fact checking. Jen, you want to flip to the next one? So when we think about kind of what we're looking at, sometimes we have just poor journalism, right? If someone makes an error, they didn't listen to all the facts, they didn't investigate far enough. In traditional media or kind of reliable media, usually there is some process where they will issue a retraction, right, or a correction later on. But we all know that the damage is usually done. So once that bad information goes out the first time in the first story, many more people see that than see the retraction. So that's one thing that we're on the lookout for, is where there might just be poor journalism. We already talked about parodies, right, where that might get into the mainstream. We also have definitely seen a rise in people intending to provoke. So can I put out a really salacious kind of story and get some kind of reaction? So whether it's provoking someone who believes the story, provoking someone who's coming back against that. We've seen this increase in passion, partisanship. I'll show either tonight or tomorrow that there's some ways to map some of our different media landscape in terms of where do they fit on a partisan spectrum, and how reliable is that information based from a partisan perspective. And this is really important because being partisan doesn't necessarily mean fake, right? Like when we see partisan news, it usually means that someone's taken something that exists, some set of facts, some information, and they're framing it in a particular way to support a certain policy position. This is by no means new, right? We've been doing this forever, since there's been people engaged in disagreement about what a good decision might be. But it's just increasingly difficult to tell when that's happening because we have so many more news outlets. I talked about people that are doing for profit, right? And I would also say that most mainstream news outlets are also for profit companies. So the Wall Street Journal is a for profit company, the Washington Post is for profit, right? So we do have a profit incentive happening out there around our information gatherers. Political influence obviously really matters. And then propaganda. We do definitely have some pieces that are just straight propaganda, and that we're what we're trying to look out for. So these are some of the things that we're kind of concerned about as we're evaluating sources. So this is the first, and we've got some tips in the handouts about doing searching. But what I want to start with is looking at, so you've done a search. You were interested in a topic. You saw someone mention something about it, and you've done a search, and now you're trying to figure out, is what you're getting, is your search result, the information that came up, is it something you can rely on? Is it something that you might be able to count on? So the tool that we've been talking about is called the smell test. And Jen, you want to flip to the next slide? I'm going to talk about the different elements of it, and then I actually want to show it to you in an article that I think is interesting, just based on the source of the article and what they do. So the smell test starts with the S, and the S of smell test is what's the source. And so here, what we're interested in is the author qualified to write about this topic? What do we know about them? Do we get a bio from them, a title? What's their affiliation? Can I find information out about them? So, are they someone who really exists in the world that I could find? So, you may see this where something will come across, or somebody will mention someone, and the first thing you go do is try to look them up, right? Where do they work? What do they do? Whether or not there's contact information. So, the more information they're giving you about the author, as a rule of thumb, I think the more reliable it tends to be, right? Because you can then follow that up. You could write a question to the author to ask them about their article. If you had a concern, you might have someone to go to who's the publisher. So it tends to be the more information that we get about the author and the actual details, the more likely they are to be being transparent and straightforward about what they're doing. I already talked about the after the on a website address, right? That something that is a .gov or a .edu or a .com is likely more reliable than a lot of the fake sites that add like a .co at the end, where they take like a real website and add a .co. So if you're really looking for good information, the .edus, .govs tend to be really strong. And .coms also. And then we're also obviously looking to make sure they're not parody sources, right? So our first things we're looking at is a source of information. And I'll show you that in this article in just a minute. The second thing we want to pay attention to is, what's the motivation for this article? Why did the person write it? Are they trying to convince me of something? Are they trying to sell me something, which sometimes happens and it's hard to tell? Is there a purpose to inform, to teach, to persuade? What's the difference? Is it an opinion piece, right? So you'll see lots of, you've probably seen quite a bit of this. There's a lot of distinction between, if you watch the Fox News channel, for instance, and you watch their opinion reporters versus their news reporters, right? There's often a lot of difference. The same thing happens for CNN and MSNBC, that their opinion pieces, their opinion personalities often have a much different frame than their news reporters, right? Because they have a different mission, a different purpose in terms of what they're up to. So the Washington Post, right? You might come across an opinion piece. There's much less editorial control over what's an opinion piece than there is in something that's a news piece. And so that's something for us to pay attention to. Does that person come to it with some institutional bias, their own personal political, cultural biases? So one of the things I do with my students, and I teach predominantly on terrorism and violent violence. And so obviously for those kinds of things, who's writing matters. So, is this person representing a government? Does this person represent a political organization that is affiliated with? I have one book that I use who the author was one of Ron Paul's national security advisors a couple election cycles ago. And that's something I talk about with my students, right? Because that political orientation informs his policy prescriptions. It doesn't make him wrong. We just need to know that, right? Have that frame in there. Is this being sponsored or advertised? Who might be paying for this work? If it's a scientific study, do we know who paid for that study? So we've seen lots coming out around vaccines and other kinds of things. There is a whole kind of, within the medical field, set of ethics around how do you report studies and who supported or funded those studies, and how do you trust them? what kind of emotional language is being used, right? Are you being primed with emotion, or are they using more nuanced language? So that's our M, motivation. Why did they write it? Why are they telling it to us? So for E, we're looking for evidence. What kind of evidence are they providing? Has their evidence been reviewed or refereed? Won't always have been the case, but can you tell if someone has looked at it? When was the information published or last updated? So, there's things can change pretty quickly, particularly if we're talking about current events, and information can change quickly. So how long ago was that presented? Can you get to links and references, particularly if you're an online source? Do they link to their original information? And that's actually a really important question to ask, because as a reader, for me to be able to do analysis, I might want to go see where did they actually get that data from? Can I link to it? And then, you've probably seen that we're always looking for grammatical, typographic errors, right? That are often indicators that someone is not as reputable as they might otherwise be. I make some of those errors, so it's not a given, but certainly the more errors there are, the more likely that they may not be as reputable a source as we'd like. The last two are related. The first L stands for logic. Does the argument make sense? Let's just use our common sense and say, does the evidence that they bring out actually line up with their conclusion? It's surprising how often that's not the case, right? That they'll have presented a conclusion and you go back and think about their evidence, and without even having done any work yourself, you're like, wait a minute, that's not the only conclusion that I could have drawn from that set of evidence. So just that logic piece is really important. Is it plausible, right? What else do you know that would make you think that that's not? And then the last L is left out. Are there opinions, for instance, that the author has left out? That's happening more and more, that I read articles where they are only quoting one side of a political affiliation or political debate, right? Or they may only be quoting people within an organization, within a university, but they're only quoting professors and not talking to students about that particular issue, right? Those would be things that I'd be worried about. Are there different perspectives that are being left out? If I was thinking about trying to identify, information that was coming in about vaccines, I'd be looking for both scientists that were from the company that's making them, as well as independent people, right, that were evaluating them. So I'm looking for that left out piece. So Jen, I'm going to hijack the sharing real quick and just go. I want to show a quick article, which actually is interesting to me for a couple of reasons. So I'm going to share this real quick. So I'm going to just quickly kind of run through how we might do that with this particular article. So can you see that, Jen? You want to give me a thumbs up? Okay. So this article, the title of this is "Why Have Female Hurricane Names Killed More People Than Male Ones?" Now, this is a little bit of a controversy that came out because of a study that came out about 4 or 5 years ago. And the premise of the article, or the premise of the study, was they were trying to figure out why, just why in general, on average, more people die from hurricanes named after women, female names, than men. And so this article, if I'm looking at my source, right, up here, I know it's the National Geographic. This actually happens to be a National Geographic blog site. So if I had come across this article, I'd already be thinking, okay, National Geographic has a fairly good, reliability rate. They are well known. I could go find them again if I want to. I could find out who sponsors them, all of that stuff. I also can go down, and sorry to scroll on you, but down here at the bottom, sorry, I've got a little paragraph that talks about the writer. Right? Who is he? How does he represent? So he writes for National Geographic blog, but it actually links to him too, right? So I can get to an entire bio. That would make me feel better about this. This is someone that I could find if I needed to, or I could ask information of. I could evaluate his credentials. If they don't tell me who's writing it, how do I have any sense of whether or not they have good credentials? Their motivation, it's a blog on National Geographic, so it's a little harder to tell. But likely is more about informing, right? They're not National Geographic. I know enough about them to know that they're not a partisan website. They're not trying to sell me, they might try to sell me National Geographics, but they're not actually trying to sell me on some kind of product or policy position necessarily. Though they may be trying to push an environmental position. If I was looking at something like that, I wouldn't be surprised if their perspective was one of environmental consciousness, right? So I might be just prepared for some bias in that respect. But I'm looking for evidence. So if I want to go up here, first I have some references, right? I also, interestingly, on this article, have some updates where they've responded to people who had criticism. That's actually really important. That means that they're taking seriously that they're part of a larger conversation. That's a really good sign in terms of whether or not I can feel like this information is reliable. Again, they've got some updates through here. I'm actually looking for, sorry, I'm looking for, I was looking for the link to the actual, okay, so here's the table. This little highlight I've got is a table that's actually going to the numbers. So this is a person writing about another study, right? A blogger writing about this study. So I could actually get to the data and look at it if I wanted to. Now, I may not know how to read that data. That may not be my skill set, but I know that I can get to it. And that's actually a pretty good sign that this may be more reliable. We also have some quotes in here in terms of evidence from people. So someone from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and again, I can link to him, right? So these are all good signs that the person is taking seriously, that they're putting together something that has some scholarly value or some value in terms of being able to demonstrate it. So it's a general sense. So my source looks fairly good. Motivation, there might be some bias in here towards environmentalism. I seem to have good evidence. What's interesting about this article, and you wouldn't necessarily, we won't be able to do it from here, but if you read it through, there's actually a super interesting flaw in logic, right? That you have to work a little bit to get to. So that their argument is that female hurricane names are more deadly, the original study, because people don't take women's names as seriously. They're not as threatened, so it's less likely to evacuate, other kinds of things. The important piece of logic that gets left out, which when you know about changes this entirely, is that until I think 1972, all hurricanes had female names. So if you think about before we had weather reporting where people could prevent or do something to get out of the way, all of those hurricanes had female names. So if you're doing an average over the last 150 years, the logic then changes, right? Once you know that piece of information. And when we were using this article and first playing with it, we didn't know that piece of information until we actually went and looked at the study. So this whole study that this person was talking about and reporting on. So that was an important piece of logic that we did before I would go and talk about this or present it to someone. I would want to make sure I understood the logic. And then in this case, there wasn't anything that stuck out to us as being left out, but you can imagine there would be. So you don't have time to do this on everything you read, right? There's no way you're going to be able to go to that level of detail. But if it's something that's important, if it's something that matters, if you're basing a decision on it, if you're trying to research something that someone has said to you and you're not sure whether to believe it or not, often I try to, in a way that's not snarky, say, hey, can you share your source with me on that? I'd like to see where you got that information. And then I have some ability to do some independent research, on what they're sending me. And so the smell test is one way to do that. I'm going to stop sharing real quick and just see if you have questions or comments on that. Is this something that you all have done? What something similar? Do you use some of these similar kinds of tools when you're looking at information?
So if you want to, as a friendly reminder, down at the bottom, if you scroll there, you should see a button with a smiley face that says reactions. You could either click on that and raise your hand. There, you could give a, one of the hands there and we'll call on you. Or if you'd like, you can also put your question in the chat or comment. Tracy has one. Tracy, would you like to go ahead and ask your question or comment?
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say that is so interesting because I've thought about that quite a bit when I read a lot of articles lately, especially since we started talking about this. So I love that we went through an article and you're thinking, oh, well, okay. And then it's like, well, but wait, in the back of my mind, the whole time I was thinking, but I thought they were always women names. So,
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah,
so that was a good example.
Yeah, and finding that piece of information that changes entirely, right, how you would view this.
Yeah. Right. No, yeah, I loved it.
Yeah, and in the handout, it goes through all those questions on the smell test. And like I said, I don't use these every time, right? I mean, I just don't have the time for everything I read. But it is useful to at least start to think about what's the source and how do I think about that, particularly when you find stuff online, right? Someone has shared something with you in social media, and I do this, and I don't know if you all do this, but I'll actually go on the website. I go to the original website of the article, and I look at the about. And I try to find two things. One, if there's a board of directors or some kind of leadership group that the organization talks about, right? So if it's a nonprofit, who's their leadership group? And the second, if I can find anything out about who funds them, because there's a lot of organizations that are really partisan in one way or another, but the name of the organization sounds super mainstream. And it's not until you go read that about page about the organization and look at who funds them, or you can look at what kind of projects they sponsor, and that'll start to give you a sense of where they land. And that's cool. Like I said, I teach on violence, right? I teach students on terrorism. One of the things I have them do is go look at sources from across the different perspectives, because that's good information. So I don't know about you all. I'm intentionally keeping people in my social media that I don't agree with at all, because I think it's really valuable for me to hear those perspectives and be able to, even if they make me angry, right? It's valuable to be able to hear those perspectives. So I don't think we have to shut down and say, no, that's bad information, I'm never going to look. We just need to know where it comes from and be able to be able to place it in a way that makes sense so that we're evaluating accurately.
I think Mimi too wanted to share a comment too. Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, I sometimes when I'm looking or researching something that's purely on social media, and there are no citations, or it's a newspaper article, but usually if they're quoting somebody from an organization, I'll go back to the organization and look at what its mission is. Not just the board of directors, because sometimes that's hoo-ha and it's the executive director that, and where they get their money from. If it's a big picture issue, I want to know who's paying for what turns up in, whether it's media of one sort or another or in print. And I usually wouldn't let my students use a single source, and they weren't, I tortured them by making them not use the web for a couple of assignments. They had to go read journals. They had to go look at real data so they could see the difference.
Yep.
But most of the stuff that appears on social media, unless you have a particular site in mind, does not have any citations.
Right.
They might have references or links, but they don't have endnotes or citations.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of times what you can also do is even just take a quote and then put the quote in Google within quote marks, and it'll often tell you where that original source was, which is often interesting, right? Because there may be one thing that gets said and it gets reported on in a variety of different places. So it feels like we're triangulating and there's all these different sources reporting the same thing, but they're all reporting on one, what one person said.
Right.
This is actually something that shifted quite a bit in the last 10 years or so. When the Washington Post and New York Times, when we all read those things in hard copy and we paid for advertisers, those media organizations had the money to have reporters in the field, right? So the Washington Post would have their bureau chief in blank, 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 right? And you'd have the New York Times would also, and the Washington Times and the Wall Street Journal would all have their own reporters out there. As we've gone to more and more online news and fewer people are paying for it, they've had to pull back on those reporting networks. So there's more and more reliance on the news wires like AP or Reuters, who are putting out a news wire, and then all of the news agencies will report on that news wire, but it all came from the same source. And there's a lot less kind of on the ground source reporting, which is a problem, I think, for all of us. And we have created, these news agencies, which is a good thing. We don't have state-run news, right? So they have to make their money somewhere. They're making them off advertisers, and they used to be off subscriptions and those kinds of things. And so they're making decisions about what they're going to be able to do and publish based on some business decisions. And that's actually was the subject of my dissertation for my PhD, was looking at how some of those media choices were made and what kind of impacts those were. And that's reasonable. They're business people. They need to keep their paper, their news station afloat, but it does have impacts on us that they don't have access to all information, and they're making choices about what information to share. And a lot of times we have a lot of people reporting on the same thing from the same source. And so we're not actually getting multiple viewpoints. We're getting one that's funneled in.
Great, thanks. And I think, Julie, we have one more here, Cynthia from League of Women Voters Hudson.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that when we're looking at, evaluating the train of logic, that we're careful not to feed our own confirmation bias,
Yep.
because we can want the article to go a certain way, and maybe it is, and we're not necessarily looking for different sources to feed different perspectives.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's this idea of lateral reading too, right? Is that how can we choose different kinds of resources? I don't know if you all looked at this. They haven't kept it up anymore, which I'm disappointed in. But the Wall Street Journal for a while, and you can still find it. It's archived on their website. They have something called Blue Feed, Red Feed, and they compared on a variety of social issues like education, immigration, healthcare. I can't remember what all the other ones were, but they actually took news sources that are traditionally considered conservative or liberal, and they showed side by side what they were reporting on those issues. And it's fascinating because you go look at them and it feels like you're living in an entirely different world, right? If you read the blue column versus the red column, it feels like it's an entirely different world. And I think that's your point about the logic, that there's depending on where you sit ideologically, your interpretation of a certain set of information might be quite different. And the what facts are going to be salient for you might be really, really different. And so really watching out for that. And I think leaving open the space that someone else's logic might be accurate, even if you don't like it. Is this a reasonable interpretation or inference from the facts? I may not agree with what their inference is, but it is reasonable. You can get from A to B of that interpretation. And I think that's really important, that it's not just that we don't like it, but that we're actually doing the kind of philosophical logic through. Do those two things add up to whatever their conclusion is? Possibly, is that a possible conclusion from that data?
Great, thanks. I think we don't have any other comments or questions at the moment.
Back to you, Jen.
All right. Great, thanks. And there'll be additional opportunities here to ask some more, make some additional comments. So let's take here. So now we're back to the PowerPoint. You see that, Julie? Okay, great. All right. So we're going to look at, actually, Julie, I wonder, would you like me to take it to the end of the slides and take a look at some of the upcoming information with the variable news sources, or would you prefer me to go ahead and go into this for now?
Why don't you do this? And if we have a couple minutes at the end, I can look at the media charts.
Okay, great. All right, so so for each of these three segments, we're going to share with you some different tools for your toolbox. Again, the tools that we'll be sharing are really thinking about if a relationship is at some level important to you, that you would use some of these tools. So thinking about what are your intentions, and thinking about how you approach the person. One of the things, and this slide was actually developed by one of Julie's other colleagues, that word respect, and I know a number of the folks who are on with us this evening, we've had this conversation. But when we think about respect, what does that look like to me? Maybe very different in behavior to Julie, from maybe our students in our classrooms or from colleagues or friends. So this can also be very cultural. And so that needs to be a discussion about what that looks like in terms of respect. Let's see here. Just checking the chat here. All right. So what I'd like us to do is think about, and we'll come back to the comment there from one of the participants there about some of the resources and things that are in the news right now. What are communication blockers? So I'd like you to consider an experience where you believed you were not being listened to. So what was happening? Think about some of the nonverbals and verbal responses that made you feel like you weren't being listened to. and put your answers in the chat, please.
All right. So if you want to put what were the things that someone did, just put it in the chat, whatever your experiences was. What were some of the things that people did that made you feel like you weren't being listened to, whether they were verbal or nonverbal? And we're just kind of curious what your own experiences were. I think of this as the things that when I have news that it's going to be hard for me to share, or something that's going on in my life that I'm not excited about. What are the things that the person that I never like to call about that does, right, when I'm talking to them, that make me feel like they're really not listening or kind of have shut me down? Right.
So some of those nonverbals, the loss of eye contact, looking at the phone, looking away, the shifting body language, talking over the person, interrupting. Checking the phone. There are several of those. Something that's a little funny is that my sister and I, our mother, we got her a new iPhone, and she got hooked onto Facebook, and we took her out to dinner, and we had to ask her to put her phone away at the table. So that was pretty funny that we had to do that at our age with our mother. Julie, maybe you can take this for a moment.
No, I like that. So what's interesting, I think, is actually more of what you all have said is about nonverbals, right? That we know something like 70% of our communication is nonverbal, and maybe even more difficult now with masks and other things when we're in person together. But the eye contact is huge. Body language is so important in terms of whether you're open or closed, and the shoulders crossed. I think absolutely the being on the phone versus not. I liked somebody's point about when people assume that they're going to disagree with you, but you actually agree, but you don't even get to finish that sentence before they've already jumped in to disagree with you. I pay a lot of attention to when I'm doing hard conversations, where am I having them? So for instance, in my office, I have a table in my office, and I also have the desk, and a lot of conversations I'll have sitting at my desk. But when I think someone needs to have a hard conversation, I move over to the table so that we're sitting kind of next to each other at the table. And the body language is different than me being behind this big old oak desk, right? So thinking about our spaces as well. Across the dinner table is a better, though I guess I have teenagers. I do lots of hard conversations in the car because they don't want to look at me, and they want to be able to kind of stare ahead while we're talking about whatever. But I think that super conscious of the nonverbals is really important, because before you even start, you've communicated quite a bit with your nonverbals. And I think this is even trickier and has been right now for the last little bit. I know I was teaching in person this fall, and I had 16 students in a classroom that could have fit 120 people. And it was a real struggle for me to identify the nonverbals and whether or not people were really still participating with me or not. So I think that there's some additional challenge that we're having with that.
Absolutely. So we're thinking about advising many times. So I think with parents especially, we're thinking about our students, our children, with advising, arguing. So these are some of the different kinds of blockers that you might see to communication that are verbal. In addition to that, what I'd like us to do is, so thinking about some of these, and here's a little bit more of a description, which is, why don't you just, or the judging about things, the reassuring and the minimizing. So what may seem not as important to you, and so you stop the conversation because the other person's minimizing what you're sharing, the analyzing, and then the questioning. And so one big communication blocker is when we're thinking about questioning, and we'll look at some of the ways to have more effective questions, is why. Why frequently puts people on the defensive. That's not clearly in a classroom. I know we have a lot of educators that are on. Clearly you can ask that question, but it's when things might be, when there might be a stressful time, when you may already not have a positive relationship or might be in the midst of a potential conflict, not to ask that question. So what I'd like us to take a look at is, and unfortunately, I'm always surprised that we have public meetings in the United States that are recorded, put online, and yet people either seem to forget or don't care about that. So what I'd like you to do is be thinking about some of those blockers. And this is a short video from a council meeting and in Maine from 2012 that's available on YouTube, and I'm going to share it with you. I'd like you to be thinking about some of those verbal and nonverbal blockers that we took a look at there. And so I'm going to play this just for a moment, just a moment. And as I pull that up, Julie, do you mind sharing a little bit about what our next session will include as well in terms of some of these skills while I pull that up, please?
Julie, you're muted.
Thank you. Again, I was using good mute discipline and then I completely forgot. Is really going to look at bias. We have a little activity that I'm going to have you guys talk about it in homework, but it's about spotting the troll and trying to identify when we see things coming across social media that are inaccurate, but also one that's looking at like filter chambers and echo chambers and filter bubbles. Maybe I'll get that right. But which is really, we're seeing this more and more, and you've probably been following the conversation this week, or maybe you have not. I have been, about Parler getting shut down last night, and the move by Facebook, Twitter, and others to, depending on who you listen to censor or decrease the role of more conservative or right voices, and that lack of and some of the concern from folks like me is that if we all go to our own platforms, right, and then we're never talking to each other, how do we possibly understand, or we start, I feel like we're beginning to lose our ability to interact with each other, and that those filter bubbles and echo chambers are important. So we're going to talk a little bit about those, and how some of those social media algorithms work in terms of giving us some of the information. Next week, we're on the conversation side, talk a little bit more about how to do, I call it supportive conversation, but how do you help someone talk to you about something that's hard for them to figure out how to talk with us about? So, the first thing I think when I talk about constructive dialogue, a lot of people say, they just have to be nicer to me. And the only person we have any control over in this conversation is ourselves, right? So these are the kinds of things that I think we can do to model the kind of behavior that we want someone to do when talking with us, to give them the ability to be able to tell us what those hard things are and open up those lines of conversation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the last session, we're going to talk more specifically about fact checking and some ways to do fact checking in both written as well as photos. So I'll show you a couple cool tools about how you can figure out if the photo is doctored or not. You've probably seen a couple examples of this, where there's one where the whale shows up or the shark shows up in all sorts of different scenes that are kind of crazy. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then also about then how do we share our own experiences in ways that are effective and allow someone to really hear us, as opposed to shutting down conversation. So that's kind of where we're heading over the next couple sessions.
Well, to make a motion to go into executive session.
No, I want to say something about this first. I've asked this before, and I got to say, every time I come to council and there's an executive session, I don't know about it ahead of time, it does kind of disturb me, because it just means that there's something going on that I don't know something about.
Well, I apologize.
I really don't like that.
When we had agenda setting, and I can explain this in the executive session a little bit more clearly, but I had asked for this, and I was under the impression it was going to happen tonight because of some timing issues with one of the items, and it didn't happen that way. It was going to be under the regular.
I thought it was next week.
Right, but I really probably ought to talk to you tonight before we have another week go by. So
well, these used to get noticed,
yes,
as part of our regular notice of meetings, so that the whole world could see that there was going to be an executive session and here's what it was going to be about as statute. And I think that it's important for us to do that.
When we can, we do.
No, I think when we should always do that. And, the one thing is that I like to know how late I'm going to be here.
I don't want you to imply that it is not right to have an executive session without advertising it a week ahead of time. We can go into executive session at any point in a meeting when we need to. That's what the rules say.
Well, that may be what the rules.
And we don't, let me finish.
All right.
And we don't say exactly what we're going to talk about, because if we did, we wouldn't need to have an executive session.
Well, I know
We're having
what
an
the
executive
rules are.
session because there are things that we can't talk about except in an executive session. I wasn't even going to schedule it until next week, in which case you would have had the 3 topics of the executive session. The city manager has asked for it tonight because he needs it before he goes to another meeting that will be affected by it.
Yeah, I understand.
So it is
all of that.
perfectly okay under our rules, and I don't want you to imply that it isn't, because that's not fair. It is
Well-
okay. So don't say any more.
You don't have to speak to me that way. You can.
Yes, I do.
Oh,
If
you don't.
If you don't
Well-
have respect
It has
for
nothing.
our process,
No, it has
then I
nothing-
have to speak to you that way.
Brian,
Counselor Pritchard is recognized.
don't throw your friggin' hat at me.
Go ahead.
I move the Rockland City Council convene an executive session pursuant to Title 1 MRSA Section 405, Paragraph 6C, which authorizes consideration of issues of economic development in relation to specific parcels in executive session, and to Paragraph 6E, so that paragraph council may meet with legal counsel to consult litigation, as well as pursue.
So hopefully you were able to see that and listen. I'm sure that this doesn't look anything like any of our city council meetings that we have here in Ohio or beyond, right? We won't name any names or cities, but which is why I also took a clip from Maine. So thinking about this, what were some of the nonverbal or verbal blockers that you saw there? Please place them in the chat if you can. What were some of the things you saw that was happening there? Doodling on the paper, pounding on the table, speaking over her, interrupting, writing, looking down, pushing up sleeves. That's a good one. I haven't had other people notice that one before, but that's a good one too. Not making eye contact. Did anyone see the red hat moving? The city council person threw it at her during the session. Working on the computer, absolutely. Raising the voice. So in thinking about some of these blockers that we saw, thank you. I think we probably had most of them on that list there that we saw.
I think for sure a lot of the verbal kind of minimizing, right? Or that your opinion isn't valid. And yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead, I think, and using rules of orders to shut people down. Absolutely. All right. So are you able to see this now, Julie? Enhancing communication. All right, great. I'm not sure why I did that. Apologies. All right, there we go. So one of the things that when we've worked with folks from Rotary and other places, which was a good point that came up, is the difference between hearing versus listening. And hearing simply happens. So we hear sound, but listening is something that you consciously choose to do. And it requires that concentration so that your brain can process the meaning from the words, that you can have a more clear understanding of what is happening. And so Glasser, many of you who are in education have heard of Glasser before, but he talks about 7 caring habits, supporting, encouraging, listening. And so these are some of those that help us with improved communication. And accepting, and this is important for when we're thinking about having difficult conversations. Accepting doesn't mean that we're agreeing. It's not the same thing, but accepting is where we're acknowledging the other person's point of view and that they have the right to have that other perspective. Trusting, respecting, and so again, that's a conversation that you need to have with folks about what does that really look like in practice with people, and then negotiating differences. And that's really thinking about the different aspects of identity, which is done in dialogue. So those are some of those different ones. So some of the other kinds of things one might want to think about too are some of the verbals and nonverbals for effective communication, asking related questions. And what I'd like you to do is take a look at this list and think about what are some of the other things that make you feel like you're really being listened to when you're having a conversation. Some of the things that may be missing from these lists. And if you could please place those in the chat. So for those of you joining us by phone and aren't able to see this, so the verbals that we have listed are asking related questions, summarizing what was said, if the person listening is including accurate feelings. And so if you could think about some additional things there in the chat, some of the nonverbals, so the tone of voice that the person has, and some of you mentioned that in the list before, you're facing the person, the eye contact and proximity, but what are some of the other things that make you feel like you are really being listened to by someone? Certainly when we think about social media, it's having our phones down. Hopefully none of the rest of you have to tell your mother, if you still have your mother, to put her phone away at the dinner table. But others? Julie, do you see any others there listed?
Yeah, I think approving by saying yes or pertinent questions that make sense, head shaking in approval. I've been super aware of this in mask world or on Zoom about needing to be much more conscious or overt about my listening behaviors, right? And really nodding, making eye contact, because it's so easy when we're disconnected or behind masks to miss that stuff. So yeah, I think the head shaking in approval, it's hard because you can't do that. I'm just going to smile at you, right? Or often you can't. So I think being really, really aware of what are those signs. But I like the pertinent questions and that are really questions. I like that. So not just asking the question to get the gotcha, but a question that's actually asking more about. And we'll talk a little bit more about those, I think, next week too. Some different kinds of questions we can do.
Absolutely, great. So Julie, do we think we have a little bit of time to practice these in our groups, small groups? Okay, great. So before we do that, let me go ahead and just share what we're going to ask you to do. We're going to put you into small groups, and Julie will do that here. I'd like you to be thinking about some effective listening skills here. So you're going to be in a group of, Julie, because we have 24, do you think maybe 6 in a group or 4 groups of 6? Or
yeah,
okay.
I can do that. I'll do that right now.
Great. So we're going to need one of you to be a volunteer per group to be the listener. So we are going to need to have volunteers within the group. One will be the speaker, and one we're going to ask you to be the timekeeper in your group. And the remaining folks who are there, I'd like you to be watching as observers to watch for effective verbal and nonverbal listening skills from the listener. So you're going to be watching that. So if you can please turn on your cameras, if you do have a camera, that would be really helpful. And then part 2 of those directions, and I'll put these into the chat here in a moment before we break into the groups, is for the speaker topic. I'd like you to pick something that led to high emotions this week. So I'm guessing that many of us can think of some things that brought high emotions. And so those could be positive or negative high emotions, stressful event or frustrating, something that really excited you. So the speaker we're going to ask you to share your story for 2 minutes. Listener, we'd like you to be listening effectively using some of those strategies that folks shared in the comment box, but also from the list. And at the end of the 2 minutes, you'll have a minute to reflect back if you'd like or clarify with any questions. And then the speaker, when the listeners completed the reflection, and timekeeper, this is where we're asking you to help a little bit, is share what the listener did that made you feel you're being listened to. And then observers, if you could share what you thought the listener did well. So we've got a few minutes there, and I'm going to put this in the chat here in a moment. And while I do that, Julie, are there other things that we should be thinking about? You're on mute, Julie.
All right. The rooms are open. People can go in. We'll broadcast, Jen. Why don't we broadcast the directions? That might be easier. You will get a countdown clock. So there'll be a little bit of time. You'll be able to see what the clock looks like, and it'll automatically bring you back. Jen, let me broadcast the directions. Sorry, I didn't mean to hit open the rooms yet, and I did. So
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Anyone else before we close here with the homework? Anything that stood out?
For me, I was in the same group as Charlotte, and I thought we had a really nice discussion, but I forget if it was Beverly or Charlotte. One of them talked about how interesting that it seems like people can have totally different viewpoints on what happened last week. And it goes back to what Julie was saying with the red list and the blue list, and how if you're looking at different media only, you have like a completely different interpretation of how it happened and why it happened and if it was right or wrong.
Absolutely. So,
But I thought I had good listeners.
Well, thank you.
great.
I mean, we made eye contact. They were shaking their heads, yes, or like they could understand. I felt like there was empathy. How does that sound?
Yeah, even using this electronic platform, you were able to get some of that, which is great. Great. Thank
Right.
you so much.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of empathy in the group. I couldn't participate well because I couldn't get my screen up. I still don't know why I'm not on the picture, but watching everybody else, that was the word that kept coming through my head. People were leaning in and, like they all sensed that the topic just seemed to resonate with everybody.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to hand it over here to Julie. I know you didn't sign on thinking you'd have some homework, but don't worry, it's easy, and everyone gets a good grade and will likely pass, I'm thinking. So Dr. Shedd, would you like to give us all our homework, please?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you one thing that's not on this list, but this is something to try, and this is something that I work really hard on. In conversation, see if you can substitute the word "and" for the word "but." So when you're talking with someone and they tell you something and you want to respond with your own opinion, our instinct is to say "but," right? And that's initially setting us up in rebuttal to them versus saying "and," right? If I move that to and, so your opinion, Charlotte, she was talking about being concerned about censorship, and your response said, well, but censorship isn't a problem because whatever we say, and I'm concerned that in this particular case, and it's a way of layering opinions.
Oh, okay.
Not in conjunction, because both can exist at the same time, like you found, right? Your two opinions can both be justifiable, and so they don't have to. And it's really hard to do. This is why I just throw it out and say, try it and see if you can do it.
Okay, thank you.
I've been working on this for a couple years, and butt still slips out on me. So it's interesting to have to do that little bit of a what's the right word? But just that little bit of an exercise in conversation to try to not do it. So I don't have that on your written homework, but see if you can give that one a try. I'm going to show you the bingo sheet in a second. Jen and I will send you this link to an article, but it's interesting about how information can things that are not true can be, you begin to see that they're true. So we'll send this link to the article. In terms of listening practice, I would just want you to be mindful listeners between now and when we talk to each other next. You know, what's happening in the listening conversation? What actions or words are you using that let someone know that you're listening? You know, we've talked about some of them, and it's actually fascinating to pay attention to our own listening, and how we're doing it, and how people are then reacting to us. And is there a change in the conversation that you're in, kind of based on your listening? And we sometimes learn the most when we do it badly and realize we've done it badly, and then try to figure out, or how to change that. So do just a couple of mindful listening. The bingo thing is fun. Jen, you want to flip to it? The idea here is just to get you to experiment with some media things that you might not otherwise do. So to pick a block or 2 or 3 on here if you want to make a bingo, to give a try to. So the top left, if you can't see it, is read an article on a current topic from an international source. So I don't know if you all do this. I read a lot of like BBC and others, because it's fascinating to get a perspective on the US from international sources and see how they think about, without our context, right? If you haven't grown up here, how do you describe that? So from international source, and do some comparison. The second one looks at the one in the middle on the block, is looking at searches. So thinking about using synonyms, what you think are synonyms for search terms, and see how your search results might differ. You can also, if you want to, do search results on like Google, Yahoo, and DuckDuckGo, and see how your search results differ, which is also interesting.
Yeah.
Top right is to listen to somebody that you think, or watch somebody you think is biased. Find a news source that you would never usually read or listen to because you think they're biased, and particularly in a way that is not your normal orientation. And take a look at the argument. Can you construct the argument? I think Cynthia's point earlier, does their argument have logical sense even if you don't agree with it? Try to think about that. Middle column on the left is looking at comments in a Twitter feed or newsfeed, find things, and you can do this right now for sure. Find things that are constructive versus destructive in terms of conversation. The middle one I think is funny. Watch a political talk show with the sound off and just watch the body language. What are people doing in conversation with each other, particularly if you get one where there's people from different ends of the spectrum who are on at the same time.
Mostly they play in their hair.
Yeah. And then we've got on the right in the middle, fact check the use of data in a news article. I'll show you how to do that if you don't have good resources for that yet. We can, you're going to have this for the next 3 weeks, so you can do them whenever you want. And then looking at evaluating the source, the bottom left, that's what we did today. Evaluate the source of an online article. The middle one, listen to a radio talk show, making a note of questions and verbal cues that block or extend the conversation. I happened to win last Wednesday. I actually flipped through all the major news networks, and it was interesting to watch the interviewers talking to the people they were interviewing. And I could tell when the interviewer thought that the person they were interviewing shared their same opinion, right? I mean, it was, you could tell by the extension questions and the blocking questions. So think about what some of those are. And then the last one is identify a piece of news you can find that's completely fake, like completely made up. And see if you can figure out how you figured out that it was fake. What were some of the things you did? So this is just meant to be fun, a couple little exercises to get you do some things that or try out some things you wouldn't otherwise do. And we'll, as Jen said, we'll send it out. And I'll show this to you again, but Jen, why don't we go ahead and flip to those media charts real quick? These are, so here's the next part. and we'll come back. There are two, so January 20th, we're back from 7 to 8:30. We're going to talk about internet searching, positions to interest, and trying to do some perspective taking, which we've talked a little bit about. Go ahead and flip to the next one. This is just, there's two charts that are on here that I will come back to again, but I want to make sure that you know that they exist. This is called the media bias chart, and the Jen's got a link in here on the left side. It's adfontismedia.com if you can read it. What I think is really what I love about this chart is that it's two-dimensional. It's left-right partisan, but it's also the bottom is not in-depth reporting at all, right? Like this is kind of clickbait stuff, people that are not actually going out and getting their own information. Going up to the top is more in-depth kind of nuanced reporting. So people that are really doing their own research. So you see like the AP and Reuters are up there at the top because they're actually doing their own research, kind of at the top in the middle. You'll also notice a difference between as you dig into it. And when you go onto their website, you can actually manipulate this and it's probably easier to work with, but you'll see the difference I mentioned between the news sites and the opinion site. So like Fox News is on here in one place and Fox News Opinion is in a different place. CNN is in one place, CNN Opinion is in a different place. But I like the idea that it's not just left and right, it's depth and reliability of reporting that we care about. And you're likely going to find something on here that you really like that is listed in a place that makes it not particularly reliable. And that's okay, right? We could argue about each one of these that we put there, but we tend to think things are more reliable when they agree with us, and they're less reliable when they don't. So I think this chart challenges us to actually look at the things that we like and see them in that context. Jen, you want to flip to the next one? This is just a little bit more simplified, more just left, right, like lean left, lean center, lean right. Might be just easier to read, but
yes, USA Today.
Yeah, so they're just
NPR.
Just a way to start looking at, looking at what's there. And if you're challenging yourself to try to read something that's on a different part of the spectrum than you normally would, might give you an idea of where to start. So we are 3 minutes over, but I think we can hang out and do questions, or if there's follow-up or particular things that you want to make sure we talk about next time.
So one of the questions for those, and again, if anyone's on that needs to leave, please go ahead and do so. We'll send you the homework here for you, the links. For those who want to stay on, we'll stay on and answer questions that you might have. But one of the questions was, Julie, where is this from, this all sides media bias chart that we're looking at?
So the all sides one, I'll put the link in the chat also. The all sides one is literally allsides.com. The other one, I just put the link, it's adfontesmedia.com, adfontesmedia.com.
Great, thank you.
I just wanted to make a quick comment about your suggestion about getting international news sources, and I completely agree. We were abroad for a little while, and one of my only US news sources that we could get on the television was CNN. And it was CNN International, which is a completely different animal than regular CNN. It is, I would say, pretty neutral. And of course, because it's international, you're getting global news, and it doesn't have the spin and the skew on it. And it doesn't have the aggressiveness and the anger and just the energy when the anchors are, telling the story. We come back stateside, when we, come back to visit family, we flip on CNN, and it's complete, well, depending on who's anchoring, but it can be complete editorial. You have to wait for special segments for the actual news to come on. So yeah, and there were a couple of other international sources that we discovered while we were abroad, and that, I continue to use here, but definitely look for international sources.
It's always interesting to see what Al Jazeera has to say about some big event over here.
Yeah.
Or I forgot the German one. I'll think of it as soon as we go away, but and the CBC, the Canadians think differently.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting to compare it. Even, you wouldn't think they'd be that different, but the CBC is very, very different in a lot of cases than
It's a core values thing.
Well, and it's
Yeah.
the choice of focus, right? I mean, one of the big things
Right.
that media have is, that they're gatekeepers. The mainstream
Yep.
media are gatekeepers of information. So what do they choose to focus on? And
Yep.
I had a really fascinating experience. It was actually a conference that Jen hosted, and it was a couple journalists for the Pulitzer Center, and I got to listen to one of them talking about why she'd chosen to write some particular stories about Afghanistan in like 2013, 2014, and it was just interesting to hear the decision-making process of them, thinking about what they thought would be relevant to our audiences. And so a Canadian audience has an entirely different audience than an American audience. So it's core values, but it's also what would be relevant to the people that are watching changes.
And I discovered that it also has to do with how much whoever they're reporting for cares about them being able to do in-depth investigation of controversial issues. I learned during the what we called Great Lakes, when the Great Lakes were first being diagnosed as in big trouble, the key newspapers on both sides of the borders had reporters that were routinely assigned to cover those issues. And it was absolutely amazing to me. There were 5 reporters over the Great Lakes that did cover it really well. And then there were a few others that were really biased. They were really spinning, and it was so obvious. But we don't have reporters in the print media so much anymore that do that.
But it's also the digital media. So, I mean, this is one of the things that I do, right? And I actually don't watch cable news as a general principle, but I think it was 2015 when there was a shooting of all the police officers in Dallas. And for a variety of reasons, I wanted to find out more about it. And I actually turned on CNN, and it was fascinating to me because what CNN broadcast for like the 30 minutes that I watched was live video that some dude was taking out of his hotel room window of the scene that was happening below him that had practically nothing in it, right? And the entire video was him talking to people in the hotel room with him about what they thought was happening. So CNN didn't have anybody on the ground, but because they were feeling the pressure to be able to report on this thing that they didn't actually have anybody on the ground for, they were streaming live this just random person with no trainings video from outside of his hotel room window. And anybody watching CNN thought that whatever this guy was saying, like they didn't have any other information.
Right.
And I thought that was actually really, when I saw that happen, I was like, oh, this is a real problem. And this is part of why we're having so much trouble is that without the professional journalists, we're getting kind of citizen reporting there's some cases that are really good, but in cases like this where there's no context, there's no one to help embed it in something, just struck me that was part of our problem.
They're just filling up dead air. They can't have dead air space. They've got to have something to fill the screen.
Yeah.
And even some of the professional reporters are assigned to cover things as they evolve. If they don't have the background knowledge to know what questions to ask. I had a former AP reporter and editor show up in my office one day and he said, would you take me on as a master's student? Because I need to know science. They've assigned me to cover all the climate change stuff and I don't know enough science to know what to ask them. So he ended up with a PhD by the time he was done. but he knew what he didn't know and he wasn't going to fake it.
Well, and he had the time to do something about it. I think that's the challenge. A lot of times they don't have the time to do something about trying to get that knowledge base.
Yeah.
So any other questions or comments before we leave? I want to thank especially the League of Women Voters Hudson for being willing to do this and offer this as a co-host with the Hudson DEI Alliance. It's so important, and we didn't even realize how even more timely it would be when we decided to do this, did we, ladies?
No, we didn't. And I've been switching back from one station to another. It's very interesting. I wish I could, just pick out the differences between perspective.
Yeah. I've had my head down all day trying to do some like detailed work. And so I hopped up to go get dinner and my 17-year-old said, so they filed articles of impeachment. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like what happened in 8 hours since I've been heads down. So things are moving quickly. It will be interesting to watch. And
and a big thank you to you, Julie, of course, for volunteering your time to do this for us again. It's wonderful. I'm personally looking forward to the next couple of sessions with you as I learn more about how to better navigate our media. One last question that came up was that they didn't see the PBS channel, only NPR. Do you mind commenting on that, or would you place PBS with NPR, or what would you say there, Julie, as we close?
I saw PBS on that layered one.
it's a good question that I haven't thought about. I didn't.
I kept looking for it and I didn't see it.
I use them all the time. You're right. I mean, I use Frontline, for instance, all the time with my students when I want them to get a little bit more nuanced perspective. So I guess in the vote with my feet department, I'm voting that they're generally fairly good at in-depth reporting and fairly middle of the road. But I have not done much investigation of that. And I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if they're on the big chart or not.
I didn't see them. NPR was, but
Yeah, right.
PBS.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Bye, everybody.
And,
Have a
bye,
nice night.
everyone.
Thank you.
And
Stay well. Stay well.
yes.
Yeah, everyone stay well.
Yeah, I'll work to get this edited then before we put it up.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.
Good night, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Julie.
You're welcome.